Good afternoon and welcome to ABTA's webinar. I am Vicky Wolf. I am the Education Manager at ABTA and I look after ABTA's work on apprenticeships, our partnerships with universities and colleges, and also our online training platform, the ABTA Knowledge Zone. This is the 10th Business Resilience webinar that ABTA has held to support our members during this time. Today, we're going to focus on workforce management during the coronavirus crisis. I don't think it's possible to stress enough that it's been a difficult time for the travel business, the travel industry and their employees. Tailored for HR professionals and those responsible for staff strategies, we hope this webinar will provide some practical guidance on the next steps for employers, from a recap on the most recent legal updates to wellbeing considerations for staff. All topics are related to how workforce management has been affected by the pandemic, from furloughing to new ways of working. But saying that, we have included a section on the new UK immigration rules, whilst not directly related to COVID-19. Given their recent introduction, we thought it was worth a recap on these as well. I'm absolutely delighted to say that over 200 people have signed up for the webinar today, and we're really happy to have so many with us. Please note that the content of today's webinar will be delivered by ABTA Partners. Today, I'd like to thank Kemp Little, Howden Employee Wellbeing and Benefits, RSM and Bournemouth University. I'd also like to thank Freshworks for being the technology partner for our webinars. If you do want to post on Twitter about your findings today, our handle is @ABTA Events and the hashtag is ABTA Workforce Webinar. Moving on, today we will be joined by 6 speakers. We have legal experts Catherine Dukes, Rebecca Butler, and Anushka Sinha from Kemp Little, David Gibbons from RSM, Hazel Craig from Howden Employee Benefits and Wellbeing, and Demetrios Bouhalis from Bournemouth University. If you want to read the full biographies, please refer to the information provided online. You can find this on Workforce Management webinar page at the abta.com/events. You'll need to click on the button where it says View Agenda. The agenda today is now on your screen. You can take a look at that while I talk you through the housekeeping. The webinar will last approximately 90 minutes and it will be recorded. I'm sure most of you will now be familiar with Zoom. Please note speakers will be presenting live today and will be available for Q&A after their sessions. Many of you have submitted questions in advance and there is the option of using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screens. Please do not use the chat or raise hand function as this is not available to you. When you do submit your question, if you could state your company name and indicate who it is for, that would be really helpful. So, moving on. First up, I'm delighted to introduce legal experts from Kemp Little for today. We are fortunate to have 3 lawyers with us, Catherine Dukes, Rebecca Butler, and Anushka Sinha, who are all from the employment team. They will be giving you an update on all things employment law, and then we'll be doing some live Q&A. So over to you, Catherine, Anushka, and Rebecca.
Thanks very much, Vicky. So the first thing we wanted to cover today was the updates to the coronavirus job retention scheme. So I'm going to briefly cover what the coronavirus job retention scheme looks like at the moment. And I'm fully aware that most people will probably be well aware of the rules around this. So I'm going to just touch on it very briefly and then hand over to my colleague Rebecca, who will talk about the changes coming into force from next month. So as I'm sure you're all aware, the coronavirus job retention scheme was support put in place by the government with effect from the 1st of March in order to enable employers to put staff on special furloughed leave, so an leave of absence from the workplace, and to receive government support for up to 80% of the employee's salary, capped at £2,500 per month, as well as having the employer's national insurance contributions covered by the government and also the employer's minimum auto-enrolment pension contribution. And during the period of special leave, employees can't work for the employer, but they can undertake training and voluntary work for other organisations. And you have to furlough staff for a minimum of 3 weeks at any time. I'm now going to pass over to Rebecca, who's going to talk you through a little bit about the updates to the scheme, and then we'll come back to look at the impact on that and the implications for employers and next steps.
Thanks, Catherine. So yes, the government has extended the coronavirus job retention scheme until the 31st of October 2020. It's going to have some added flexibility from the 1st of July, which means that employers will be able to bring back employees on a part-time basis, which we're calling flexible furloughing. Now the July date is a month earlier than expected, which is no doubt good news for employers so that they can have a more flexible workforce in place. And the flexible furlough scheme will mean that employees should be paid their normal wage when they're actually working and then receive the furlough grant for the remainder of their usual working hours. Now the grant and the £2,500 cap on the furlough grant will be reduced in proportion to the hours not worked. So now I'm going to talk about a little bit more about what we might expect from the furlough scheme. Now I should add that we've only yet received a fact sheet, which I've put the link on the slide there. We are expecting more guidance on the 12th of June. So at the moment, this is based on what the fact sheet says, which is limited in scope. Now, is there a minimum or a maximum number of hours that you can have employees working on flexible furlough? The answer to that appears to be no, on the basis of what we've seen at the moment. So that means that you can agree any arrangement with the employee on flexible furlough. And from the 1st of July, there is no minimum furlough period, although the guidance states that a claim under the scheme must cover a period of at least 1 week, but there's no minimum period of furlough like the previous scheme of 3 weeks minimum period. So you can have the flexibility to agree what hours employees are going to be working on a week-to-week basis, provided that you report and claim for a period of a week at a time. Now, of course, while this flexible furlough scheme is new, it doesn't mean that you have to furlough employees if you flexibly if you don't have the work for them. You can, of course, continue to furlough people on a full-time basis if you're not in a position to provide them with work. And as I said before, more guidance is expected on the 12th of June, so we should have a lot more detail at that point. In terms of what you can claim for an employee on flexible furlough through the scheme, the fact sheet says that you'll be able to claim the grant for the hours that your employees are not working, calculated by reference to their usual hours worked in a claim period. And as I said, the grant and the cap will be reduced in proportion to the hours not worked. So you're going to need to report the hours worked and the usual hours an employee would be expected to work in any claim period of at least 1 week. Now, in practice, that means you're going to need a system to record hours worked and not worked, which if you've got that already, then great, it'll save you a job. But if you have employees that were previously salaried employees whose hours you may not normally have tracked, then you're going to have to think about how you're going to capture that going forwards. And as I say, at the moment, there is no detail on how employers are meant to do that, but start to have a think about it in advance of the 12th. In terms of whether you need a new furlough agreement for under a flexible furlough arrangement, the answer to that is yes. The fact sheet confirmed that where you are agreeing a new flexible furlough arrangement with your employees, you will need to enter into a new furlough agreement and confirm that in writing. Moving on to the next slide. What does the scheme cover in terms of the reduction to the grant? Well, you're going to have to make a gradually increasing contribution towards salaries over time. Now, for July, it will remain the same, but from August the 1st, you will have to make an increased contribution. The government contribution will be the same in August, capped at 80%, but you will have to contribute employer national insurance and pension contributions. In September, you'll also be required to contribute 10% of wages and the government contribute 70%. And for October, your employer contribution increases to 20% and the government will contribute 60%. And thereafter, the scheme will close from the end of October this year. Now, there's a few key dates that you need to be mindful of with the new extension to the scheme. One is that it will be closed to new entrants from the 30th of June, meaning that only employees who have spent a full 3 weeks on furlough before that date can continue to be furloughed or work under the new flexible furlough scheme. So that means that the last date for employees to be furloughed for the very first time is in fact today, the 10th of June. So if you are thinking about furloughing employees for the first time, then you need to be quick and do it this afternoon in order to allow them to do that minimum 3-week furlough period that is required under the current scheme. So another key thing to note is that from the 1st of July, you won't be able to overlap, or claim periods will no longer be allowed to overlap calendar months. And so claims must be made for each period of furlough within each month. And all claims for the period ending 30th of June must be completed by the 31st of July. A key aspect of the new scheme is that from the 1st of July, the number of employees you can claim for in the claim period cannot exceed the maximum number that you've claimed for under any previous claim. And how that works in practice is that you're going to need to work out the maximum number of employees that you will want to make a furlough claim for from the 1st of July onwards, and ensure that that number has been furloughed in one previous claim period. So as an example, suppose you've been rotating 20 employees on furlough. So that means that you've only ever claimed for 10 employees at any one time while the other 10 are at work. You can't put all 20 employees onto part-time furlough from the 1st of July because that would exceed the maximum number you've claimed for under your previous claims. So if you want to be able to put all 20 employees onto furlough from the 1st of July, then you'll need to make sure that you claim for all 20 employees in June. So just be aware of that and make your plans accordingly this afternoon if you need to make some adjustments so that you can have that maximum number of claims going forwards from July the 1st. And with that, I'll pass back to Catherine.
Thanks, Rebecca. So what next? Where does this leave you? Well, you may be considering using the flexible furlough scheme, in which case you'll be considering a return to the workplace for furloughed staff. And you may be thinking more broadly about bringing staff, even staff who haven't been furloughed and who've been working from home, about how you bring them back into the workplace. If you're doing that, then you do need to bear in mind, obviously, that as an employer, you have a duty of care to provide a safe place of work. And as part of that, you need to take account of the government's guidance on providing a COVID-19 secure workplace. So the government has produced 8 different guides depending on the type of workplace that you provide. And one of the other speakers, David, is going to cover this in more detail in a few minutes, so I won't go into a large amount of detail about that. But just to say that you will need to undertake a health and safety risk assessment before bringing staff back into the workplace, bearing in mind these guidelines and building those into your practices in order to ensure that employees have appropriate social distancing whilst they're in the workplace. Also, you need to think about any vulnerable groups. Have you got employees who are perhaps over 70 or are clinically extremely vulnerable? They may be having cancer treatments or something like that, but able to work. And in which case you may need to make special provision for them. It may not be appropriate to bring them back into the workplace at the current time, and maybe they can be continue to work from home. And then also you need to think about the fact that many employees may still have childcare issues. Some schools have opened, but only for certain age groups. So it may be that either they can't return to work terribly easily in terms of returning to the workplace, and may need to continue to work from home in order to look after their children. So it's worth thinking through those issues. And unfortunately, the government hasn't produced a lot of guidance for employers on how to handle those particular situations. So it's worth thinking about them very carefully, and a lot of the time it's difficult to give one specific piece of guidance that would apply to every situation for an employee with childcare issues, because the facts can vary quite significantly from different cases to different cases. And then the other thing to think about with the changes to the furlough scheme is, what if you can't afford that increased employer contribution? Are you having to face making redundancies? If you are having to look at contemplating redundancies, then there's a few points to think about in terms of planning. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time today to go through the full detail of what you would be required to do for a full consultation process, but I can outline some of the key factors here, and then if anyone has any questions, we're happy to pick those up. But the first thing to think about is the numbers that you're proposing to make redundant at any one establishment, so any one workplace, in a 90-day period. If you're making 20 or more redundancies, then you'll need to follow a collective consultation process. And that involves ensuring that you have appropriate representatives in place that you can consult with. So that might be a recognised trade union, or it might be an existing employee representative body. But if you don't have either of those things, then you'll need to ask the employees to elect representatives and then consult with those elected people. You'll also need to submit what's called an HR1 form, which is a form to submit to the Secretary of State for Business, notifying them of collective redundancies. And then you conduct the collective consultation process. And how that works is it's a series of meetings with the employee representative body where you provide certain specified information to them. If there are 20 more redundancies, between 20 and 99 redundancies, then it's a 30-day consultation period. And if there's 100 or more redundancies, then it's a 45-day consultation process. If you've got less than 20 employees being made redundant, then you don't have to follow the collective consultation process. You would just need to have meetings with the individuals affected. And typically this would be over a sort of 1 to 2 week period, depending on whether you've had to go through a selection process to choose which employees are going to be made redundant or not, because that can slightly complicate the collection, the meetings that you have to have and the information that you need to provide. So the most important factors to bear in mind are that you need a fair reason, i.e. a genuine redundancy reason. So usually that will be a diminished requirement for that particular role or a closure of the workplace. You need to follow a fair process as I've described, so either a collective consultation process or the individual process. You could think about asking for volunteers for redundancy, and that can often reduce some of the admin burden for you in doing redundancies. But do bear in mind that there are some downsides to it as well. So things like the fact that you may lose all your most experienced workers because they'll be the ones who are attracted to the higher redundancy package that might be available. And whilst it might be better for productivity in terms of helping staff, not putting staff at risk of redundancy and consulting with them unnecessarily, it can be difficult to manage that, the fact that you can't choose who you're making redundant if you've got the voluntary process. As I touched on briefly before, if you're not using volunteers, where you have employees whose jobs are broadly interchangeable, so their duties are broadly the same, and say you're reducing from 10 down to 5, you'll need to go through a fair and objective selection process using fair and objective selection criteria. And typically that's done either by relying on historic appraisal information or asking the manager to undertake a selection matrix. And then you also need to think about the redundancy package and whether you enhance that or not. So typically that would be statutory redundancy pay and notice pay, plus any pay in lieu of accrued but untaken holiday. So those are the main things to think about. I'm now going to pass on to Anushka, who's going to deal with the immigration update.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the immigration update. I'm going to start with the coronavirus updates. So just a flag for those of you who are doing right-to-work checks during this time, they've temporarily been adjusted due to the coronavirus situation in order to make it easier for employers to carry them out. So as of the 30th of March 2020, checks can be carried out over video calls. Job applicants and existing workers can send scanned documents or a photo for the checks using email or a mobile app. And then the employer should ask them to hold up the original to the camera to check it against the digital copy and record the date that the check was made. And they should also annotate it to say that adjusted checks were undertaken on X date due to the COVID-19 situation. Just to flag, the employer checking service is still available if any of the prospective employees don't have the requisite documents. And also the EU settlement scheme, for those individuals who've got status under that scheme, they can use the online right to work check service during a video call with their prospective employer. Retrospective checks in person will have to be done, however, when these temporary adjustments have ended, and the Home Office is expecting those checks to be done within 8 weeks. With regard to those who are Tier 2 sponsors, reporting requirements have been adjusted, so there'll be no enforcement action and no need to report any student or employee absences due to coronavirus, if that's due to illness, having to isolate, or inability to travel. So just to flag there, reporting requirements for absences are at the moment adjusted. If anyone is in the UK with a visa due to expire between the 24th of January 2020 and the 31st of July, they can apply. If they don't intend to stay in the UK on a longer term basis, they can apply for an extension, which will be granted by contacting the coronavirus immigration team, and we'll be sharing the links and contact numbers for those teams within the Home Office, and that team should respond within 5 working days to say that that individual's leave has automatically been extended to 31st of July. With regard to in-country switching, so normally if an individual needed to leave the UK to apply in their home country, and if their leave is due to expire between the 24th of January again and the 31st of July, they can apply on an exceptional basis to switch in-country if they can prove that they were unable to travel or leave the UK. And with regard to visa application centres overseas, they are starting to now reopen. From the 22nd of June, we'll see some centres opening in China and Australia and in France. So just to flag that people can now start making entry clearance applications and giving biometrics. I'm going to quickly move on to the future immigration system. So the UK government intends to end the transition period on the 31st of December this year, which would mean that the new immigration system would still come into force from the 1st of January 2021. The details are yet to be confirmed. However, we understand that with regard to the controversial minimum salary threshold, this will no longer be £30,000, but will be reduced to £25,600. However, there won't be any regional variation of salary thresholds. It will be one standard minimum threshold for the whole of the UK. The skills threshold in positive news will be reduced potentially from RQF 6 down to RQF 3, which can help some employers who have perhaps a different skills level requirement. And in very welcome news for those of you who've ever had to grapple with the resident labour market test, that is potentially going to be abolished, as well as the cap being removed. There will, however, be an English language requirement, as there is now, and may be more widely required. And just to flag as well, for those companies who don't have a sponsor licence, the main mechanism through which new EU migrants new to the UK and any non-EU migrants, if you want to allow them to work potentially in the UK, the sponsorship route will be the mechanism through which to do that. So you might want to consider applying for a sponsor license, and we understand that the sponsor license process will be a much more light to touch approach for new applicants, and that will open from autumn 2020. So that's my whistle stop tour. I'm going to hand back to Vicky, I believe.
Thank you. We have now got time for a few questions. So if anyone has any questions to add, you can ask these as well, and we'll go through them. We did have one from Julian Stark. If we have a rota of staff on furlough, what happens if one or more starts a rota on the last day of the month? They will have other time on furlough during the same month. So would that be okay, so long as the overall claim is for the minimum of a week?
Rebecca, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, so if you are, and I believe this is for a question after the 1st of July rather than before, if you, the minimum, the claim period is of at least 1 week. So if they've got time during the rest of the month, then you would be able to put in a claim for that. But you need to make sure that you're going to include all of the employees that you want to make furlough for each claim period, put in that claim, because you won't be able to make a claim for the same period that overlaps with it. But yes, it's the minimum claim period is of at least a week. So furloughing it over the course of the month, if you keep a record of the hours that they've worked and not worked, you'll be able to make a claim on that basis.
Okay, thank you. We did have another question as well from C. Shah at Sona Tours, and this was about whether there was any plans to extend the furlough scheme for the travel industry. Have we got any updates on this, or do we have any specific guidelines?
As far as we're aware, there's no plan at the moment. It's obviously being extended until the end of October anyway at the present time, and you have the flexibility, so you can either continue to furlough staff on a full-time basis, albeit that from August, you'll have to start contributing more money. We're not aware of any proposals to change that for the travel industry specifically, or for any other industries specifically at this stage. But it's certainly something that is being lobbied about very hard. So watch this space, I think is probably the message.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Donna Alcock for Anishka. Can you reconfirm that lowest salary threshold is relevant for the future immigration system?
I can't confirm it yet because we're still waiting for the immigration rules to be published, but we understand that will be the case and anticipate there should be towards the end of the year. The new immigration rules will be published, and then with a plan to come into effect from the 1st of January. But we understand that they will be reduced to RQF3. But we can always stay in touch if you would like, and I can send any updates over as we get them.
And Donna's come back there. She said she's actually, she meant the figure.
The salary figure. Anishka, do
you sorry for misunderstanding that. It's the same in the sense that these are the proposals, but they haven't yet been laid before Parliament, and the immigration rules haven't been published yet. So we anticipate that's what's going to happen, but we are waiting for confirmation.
What's the actual amount, Anishka?
It was sort of in the press and controversially 30k, but it seems to be that the UK government is going to take into consideration the MAC, which is the Migration Advisory Committee's recommendation, to reduce it to 25,600 as a minimum threshold.
Okay.
So watch this.
We've got another question from Jane Solomon. Is it okay to start the redundancy process with staff who are currently on furlough?
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yes, you can consult with staff who are furloughed. So the government has confirmed that you can hold redundancy consultation meetings, and that won't be counted as work. So you don't need to unfurlough staff to be able to do the redundancy consultation. And also, once you've been through the consultation process and decided to terminate, you could keep staff on furlough and whilst they're on the notice period, and benefit from the government's support during the notice period as well.
Okay. And then we have another question relating to the Immigration Act. Hi, it's from Stuart Pinnell. Do you have any information on the future of posted workers directive from the UK to European countries for winter 2021? Are A1s going to be issued by the HMRC? Will European countries recognise them after the 31st of December 2020?
Lots of interesting questions. There is a draft negotiating agreement which contains some provisions between the UK and the EU of what will be in place after the end of transition, which we are working through right now. And I'm a member of ILPA, which is the Immigration Law Practitioners Association, and we're going to be looking at those draft provisions to see if it covers those kind of scenarios. With regard to the HMRC question, I'm afraid that might be outside of my pay grade, but I think I can certainly come back to you as and when we know a bit more about what will be in place, particularly for the posted worker directive.
Thank you. We have another question here from Joanne Robertson. We have someone who has returned from maternity leave on the 1st of June and has gone straight on to furlough. from August, she has said that if she comes back into the office, she wants to go part-time. So would we be able to apply her new part-time hours from the 1st of August for the furlough scheme if she's not back at work then?
Rebecca, do you want to pick that one up?
Yes, yeah. I think if it's it's by agreement with the employee. So so yes, you know, the furlough scheme allows employees to work on a part-time basis. So you'd reclaim for the hours that she's worked.
Thank you. We have a question from Martin Churchill. If we bring back staff for 1 day a week, i.e. 20% of the time, does that then reduce the furlough money we get by that much?
Rebecca, my understanding is that the grant is reduced in proportion to the hours worked. So the answer to that would be yes.
Yes.
Yeah. We're waiting for the difficulty with this is that the guidance the government has published to date isn't any more specific than that, let's put it like that. So we're waiting, slightly frustratingly, we're waiting till the 12th when they publish the more detailed guidance, in the hope that things like this are very clear in that guidance. But it's frustrating for anyone who's wanting to furlough someone from the 10th, from today, that they don't have any detailed guidance about what this scheme is going to look like until 2 days after they're supposed to have started the furlough. So it's very frustrating for employers who are trying to get their heads around it at the moment.
Okay, we've just got a couple more questions and then I think we'll have to close that. So we've got one from Michelle. Can employees be told to take holiday during furlough? Can an employee work their notice and holiday entitlement during furlough?
So employees can be required to take holiday during furlough, but the employer has to top them up to 100%. They're entitled to their normal pay during holiday and bank holidays if they normally don't work bank holidays. So as an employer, it's a difficult one. Some employers are thinking, well, when we come back off furlough, we don't want all our employees still having their full year's holiday entitlement that they can take after they come back from furlough. So they're asking staff to take holiday now, but the downside to that is that they have to pay them full pay for that period and only get the 80% top up, 80% grant from the government. So it's a bit of a one to weigh up for employers, really, and same goes for notice. So yes, as I said before, employers can use the furlough scheme for employees who are working out their notice because they've been made redundant. So yeah, they can do that, and there are some complicated rules about whether you have to pay full pay during the notice period or not. It depends on whether the employee is entitled to more, whether their contractual notice entitlement is longer than their statutory notice entitlement. I think it's probably best, if anyone's got any specific questions about that, please do contact us and we're happy to answer them directly, because it's one of those things where we probably need to look at the individual's employment contract to advise.
Yes, just to say that the contact details, your contact details are on the slide pack, so if people want to get in touch afterwards. Just to keep to time, thank you all for your contribution. That was fantastic. Really appreciate that. We are going to move on. Next up is David Gibbons from RSM. David is an HR consultant and is going to walk us through what the future workplaces could look like and provide some food for thought around your business's working environments. Thanks, David.
Perfect. So thanks for having me, everybody. As Vicky said, I've got about 15 minutes, so I'm mindful that we've got a lot to get through. So I suppose in my title slide, I've got the words sort of what could the future of workplaces look like, and I suppose could is being the operative word there. So at present, obviously, work is going to be a very different place, as in if people do come back to their place of work, if it wasn't at home before. I think People Management, which is the CIPD magazine today, have got the heading of "It's the End of Work as We Know It," which is quite pertinent. But if we sort of look back on sort of I suppose the sector and the industry as a whole, customer sentiment and, the need for travel and tourism obviously is been hit pretty hard. The 14-day quarantine placed most recently has only added to sort of the fears that the industry is going to struggle to recover. But obviously what is work going to look like when some form of normality returns? You know, what skills are going to be needed by the staff that are going to be working for your organisations, and kind of how are they going to be working? Where are they going to be working? So what I'm going to do is just in my agenda, I'm just going to quickly run through some flexible ways of working, and predominantly that's going to cover returning to the workplace if it needs to, and obviously if people are still going to be working from home, then what are some of the things around the engagement area that we could look at. We're going to look at some of the more sort of broader parts, and I think it'll touch quite nicely on previous, the workforce planning, and maybe some of the things that you need to start thinking about now, that we have that sort of October deadline at the moment in the future. So I'll do what I can to run through. I won't go into too much detail, just conscious of the time, but obviously we can touch each element as we go through. So I'll move on to my next slide. So at the moment, the government guidance is that everybody should try to stay at home and remain working from home if they can. Ultimately, your businesses, and I'm conscious that we've got lots of different size businesses and operating businesses on the webinar, but ultimately the government guidance that we are looking at suggests that if you can still work from home, then you should absolutely do the best you can to do that. As I mentioned before, and this was back here, I think it was the 10th of May, but there was specific guidance documents on the government website for certainly for these companies here, offices and contact centres, as well as shops and branches, which I think are the two sort of broad categories that many of you will fall under. But each of those guidance documents focuses on the effective management in light of the COVID outbreak, and obviously protecting your employees. So what we've done here is we've just put that into sort of I suppose an infographic of working from home if you can. However, if you do need your staff to be in the office, then the government risk assessment, which you can find online, it gives you more information, has to be completed. And this also should be signed by a member of the senior management team, who is satisfied that every measure that has been taken is comprehensive and it's in line with the government guidance. But I suppose more informally, if we look at the fact that many of you are going to have furloughed staff that have been off work for probably the best part of 3 months, they're going to be having some sort of reservations, or they're going to certainly be having feelings towards a return back to work, whether or not that's commuting into the office, being within the office, etc. So everything that you do, we would say, should involve some form of element of your staff contributing, simply because it provides some buy-in from those staff who can, they do know the offices with which you work inside out, so actually they can provide some really valuable input as to how safely you can work, and at the same time you're allaying fears of potential challenges and certain things that might come up when you do eventually bring people back to work in whatever guise that may be. So the takeaway point here is that obviously sharing is important to make sure that if you are bringing people back to work, you can involve them, you can communicate with them your plans. And obviously I'll come on to it a bit later, but knowing that October is sort of a deadline for the end of furlough as it stands, it does give you some form of planning capability in order to suggest when going back to work might be feasible and how you might be able to tackle that in the best way possible. But definitely providing a safe working environment and having that sign off, making sure that the risk assessment has been completed, is absolutely paramount. In the grey boxes and green boxes that you'll see from the slide deck, these are just some of the things that probably we're all very familiar with now. Things like social distancing, signage, how you lay out the office to make sure that you're adhering by the rules that are set out by the government. And again, just making sure that communication is key. So on to the next slide. The people that are going to be remaining at home, or the people that are going to be working from home, and on Catherine's point and the team's point before around the fact that, you know, furlough is going to be changing and part-time variations are going to be included, there is going to be potentially for some of you people that are going to be on site and people that are going to be continuing to work from home. And actually the disparity between those two groups of people can be quite large, because on the one hand, there are going to be people that would say they're coming into work and that's a change in what they're doing, compared to people who are still at home and have been for some time. So some of the things that we would cover here around how you're going to manage the performance of your employees, for either those that come into the office or for those that continue to work from home. One of the things that our clients have been telling us is, although everybody is at home and safe, it's actually very difficult to manage performance, because you're providing a lot more autonomy to your employees who were not necessarily aware of that before COVID broke. But obviously things like KPIs will be critical. Your subjective assessment on how people are performing, having data and having outcomes as to what your people are doing to then inform your strategy is going to be critical. As I said before, the health and well-being and your staff involvement is going to be critical to that. I suppose, staff that have been away for 3 months, their health and well-being is going to be absolutely paramount in terms of how they're going to return to work. And I know that Hazel will be covering some of that after, but we are very aware that people working from home and continuing to work from home are going to see changes in their employment, how they're going to be interacting. They're going to be back speaking with customers, how that's going to work, how that's going to affect them in terms of the amount of time that they are on their screen, how much they're working face to face with their clients. So all of that coming from furlough is going to be a bit of a transition. So that's something that needs to be, I suppose, contemplated. And anxiety and stress has been all over the press recently about how people are coping with not just the work elements of being off work, but also just COVID more broadly and being in lockdown. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about your employee state when they are coming back to work in whatever guise that is. Those 2 points sort of come together quite well in terms of managing the engagement of your employees. So although many of you will have, and some of you won't have, things like engagement surveys, we're finding more and more that although the businesses have been taking as much care as they can to ensure that their staff are safe and that they're furloughed, or if they are working, they're doing everything they can to help them, actually finding out how your staff are feeling and looking at what they believe or what they feel are going to be hindrances or challenges for the next 6 months is actually going to be a very critical point, because in their minds, they're going to be very aware that they're going to be going back to work if they are furloughed, or if they are going to be coming back, it's going to be on a part-time basis. And probably the overarching fear is that redundancies and layoffs within the UK economy, let alone the travel and tourism industry, might actually be a reality rather than a theory. So for employee engagement is really getting to understand what your employee are thinking and how they're feeling about work, returning to work, and also what their feelings would be to, how that would look for them, and managing that distributed workforce of home workers, on-site workers, or whatever contract it is that they have. So although it seems that it's theory, but actually the ability to stay agile through all of this is going to be absolutely key, because through the 4 boxes there on the top, understanding the plan for the future, aligning your people to that strategy, even though it will change from time to time, it's probably inevitably going to change for a lot of the businesses on the call, making sure that your planning and replanning is absolutely vital. Okay, so on to the next slide. Workforce planning is something that I'm sure everybody has been contemplating over the past 3 months, but what we've attempted to do is just break this down into some of the things that we can do in light of the information that we do have. And again, I'm using this end of October deadline almost for the furlough scheme as almost a way of you starting to plan ahead in terms of what challenges you might anticipate, and then working your way back to now to see what actually you need to provide or what you need to start thinking about in order to get to that 31st as best as possible. So the visibility of level of support that will be given by businesses is now laid out to a degree, but I think that the 12th of June, this Friday, and how the furlough scheme is going to work going forward, and some of the particular details around that is going to help inform your strategy. However, proper informed advanced planning of what you're going to be doing in terms of, are we going to be having how many people on furlough whilst other people are working from home? Are we going to be having rotations? All the way up to the various deadlines that was mentioned before around the 1st of each month. Slowly but surely, we're getting people back into the workforce. Modelling your workforce costs, so looking at actually what the grant sums are going to be that you could potentially receive over those months, and aligning that to the salary outlays that you're going to be having to make from now until October is going to be a straightforward but also quite impactful calculation, because ultimately you don't know what the business is going to be doing in 3 to 6 months. You have the information that's available to you, but obviously we don't really know the kind of bounce back, or indeed the kind of journey that the industry is going to be going through in the next 6 months just yet. So making sure that you look at the legal implications and the contractual implications of any decisions that you do make is going to be very important. And then for the furlough agreements, I think it was mentioned before by the team, is the documents that you have for your furlough agreements at the moment will inevitably change, because you're ultimately asking people to come back with some of the thoughts and feelings, but also do they agree to the terms that they've been asked in terms of their furlough, their part-time working, etc. So having those in the back of your mind is very important in terms of when you're making those decisions, are you making sure that you're mitigating risk along the way? Okay, so things like clarity of pay, making sure that you can adapt where possible to the furlough scheme, and are there any requirements that are going to be made of you specifically as a business going forward will obviously be important, as well as the contractual changes associated with it. And so just last slide, because I'm conscious of time. So just for some practical tips, I suppose, which, although, you know, I know I'm conscious that there's a lot of information that's going to be going through, but certainly the things that we've been supporting our clients with, certainly the things that we've been telling our client base is, whether you're in a branch, if it's a contact centre or any other business for that matter, making sure that you're following that guidance from the government that's going to inform your decisions as a business going forward is absolutely critical. There is a business element to it, but it's also bringing your people along that journey with you. So ensuring that those people are aligned to that strategy, but also bought into that strategy is absolutely key. Finding out what your employees do want, how they are feeling, what the last 3 months has, you know, I suppose what it's done to them in terms of how they're feeling about returning to work, what are their thoughts and views about what needs to be in place if they do come back to work, looking and sensing what their queries might be around any contractual changes that you have got is also important, just to understand what the saliency is to a change in working environment and a change in time working for them is. Obviously the implications, both from a tax perspective, a legal perspective, ensuring that whatever you are doing is in line with government guidance, is making sure that you're doing everything you can to be risk averse in terms of both a safety perspective and a business perspective. And then obviously as you're moving forward is that continued agility. So are you going to have to keep reassessing, reevaluating your models going forward as to how you bring these people back? What does that look like? What's the time period that we do want these people to come back? And how are we going to manage that both from a day-to-day perspective, but also in terms of managing performance, making sure that people are aware of their roles, what we require them to do and what the outputs of that look like. And I've mentioned it a few times in the previous slides, but communication is going to be absolutely key for this. Is we do know that a lot of our clients don't actually communicate as much with the furloughed employees and their staff at the moment as they used to when they were all at work. And that's everything from informal conversations to more formal conversations about their work, even if it's just to have a video conference call with them or the team, drinks on a Friday, etc., just to make sure that you have got that buy-in, because at the moment you cannot over communicate with people. It's absolutely important, or absolutely critical, that they understand what's going on with the business, what your plans are, because that's what's going to be really important when you do start to outlay some of these plans in the next 3 to 4 months. And I think finally, just, I think everybody's sort of quite salient to this already, but leveraging the technology that we do have and also the learnings that we have over the past 3 months should inform what we do going forward. I suppose the key there again is just remaining open to change, making sure that you do have everything in your armoury to make informed decisions quickly as a result of government guidance or indeed what might be happening in the industry as a whole. And I think that's it from my slides. So I'll pass back over to Vicky.
Thank you very much, David. We have had some questions through. So Emma asks, if we chose to close our main office and change the location of work for most of our employees to be home-based, would we need to consult with our affected employees on a change of work location, change to T&Cs? But if some said they were unhappy with the change as they dislike working from home, would we need to make them redundant, or would we dismiss and rearrange on new terms and conditions?
Yeah. So obviously, depending on, and I suppose the answer is depends with regards to what's in their employment contract. So ultimately, in my mind, the key here is that if you are changing something in their contract to say that we no longer are going to have this office or we're moving these offices, that is a conversation that can be had outside of the employment contract, but ultimately a change is being made. So I suppose you having that conversation up front with the employee to explain the business reasons and the decisions that have been taken about the office, and actually there is a requirement. Often you'll find that employees are going to be a lot more, they might even be very pro working from home a lot more. But ultimately, if you are going to be changing something in the contract, like place of work, have that conversation up front with your employees, make sure they're salient and they're involved in that conversation, because that then means that if you do have to make the change to the contract, which you can do formally, then there isn't necessarily pushback. On the second point, ideally, again, if you technically, if they are unhappy with change and they refuse to accept the changes to their employment or whatever is going to be going on, then you then have to have that frank conversation of the consultation and redundancy is the only real outcome of this. However, you can then re-engage with them on those new terms. I would suggest that that's not really the way you should go about it. And Catherine and her team can input that on that as well. But I suppose if they are going to be changing, it's almost giving them the reasons and the rationale as to why this is happening. At the moment, contract changes under the furlough scheme and COVID are coming through and can be made for that. However, if they are more permanent, then if something is going and they do disagree with that or they refuse that, then you would need to terminate that contract. I suppose try to do anything you can under the existing agreement rather than disengage and then re-engage.
Okay. We have had another question as well. With regards our return to work plan, should we be doing anything extra to support BAME employees who are 4 times higher risk category? And we just wanted to ask any advice you might have in relation to this.
Yep. So we have been speaking to our clients about exactly that, and I suppose based on the statistics, I suppose we do need to carefully consider employees with any additional needs or protected characteristics. At the moment, I would say that following the government advice and guidance, and you've mentioned it there about the statistic about BAME employees potentially being 4 times at risk, is within your risk assessment, I suppose that would be something that you should and would consider, because ultimately if that does pose a risk and there is evidence to support that risk, is that every I suppose consideration should be given and should be made to potential challenges or potential risks within coming back to work.
Okay, thank you. We've just got 2 more questions and then I'll end it after those. The next one is from Andrew, who says, what's your view on our obligation, if any, to contribute to working from home expenses like work, furniture, electricity, etc.?
Yeah, so and at the moment I'm not fully aware of any specific obligations. I suppose it comes down to the chicken and egg here of if your employees do have work furniture or office furniture that allows them to conduct their work in the way that you need them to, and what's in their contract. I suppose it boils down to what is in their current contracts and what you can and do provide them in their normal work. But it is safe to assume that if they are going to be asked to continue the work that you have asked them to do within an office environment, that if they are going to continue to do the same work at home, the same provision should be provided. However, I'm not aware of any obligations at the minute because I imagine it's a relatively grey area. However, I would argue that you could use this as an engagement tool as opposed to an obligation. So providing screens or providing chairs with lumbar support, etc., things like that could actually do the opposite of saying, well, instead of it being an obligation of ours, actually we're very keen to get our employees very engaged with what we're doing. So as a result, we are providing X, Y, Z in order to make sure you've got everything you can to be as good as you can be, essentially. So yeah, the short answer is I don't know of any obligations. However, I would certainly think that if you do want to get your employees performing, that actually you do consider what things will be able to help them to perform their role and obviously contribute towards those KPIs.
Yeah, thank you. And just one last question. Do you have any advice for making redundancies over video calls?
Well, yeah, I mean, the advice I suppose I would give, I mean, it's absolutely, a necessity, just like some of the things that have been mentioned before, that video conferencing almost is the new norm. It is at the discretion of the business as to how they go about these conversations. Face-to-face has obviously been the norm, just purely because of the way that we could work together. However, if you are going to be doing it over video conference, I would argue that you should be trying to provide every, let's call it, characteristic of a normal conversation. So ensuring that you have a clear line, ensuring that you're running through all of the obligations that you have when doing a redundancy consultation, for example. But ultimately, all of the boxes still need to be ticked in terms of how you are approaching it. One of the things that you don't necessarily have is that face-to-face interaction. So ensuring that the video conference mimics in as best way as possible the face-to-face interaction, and anything that you need to provide is going to be the best way to do this.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll leave it there just in the interests of time, but thank you very much, David. Next up, I'm delighted that Hazel Craig, who's a Senior Data Analytics and Wellbeing Consultant at Howden Employee Benefits and Wellbeing, is joining us. Hazel's going to talk to us about wellbeing issues that are facing employees, especially around building confidence around returning to work. So over to you, Hazel.
Thank you, Vicky. So just holding on this slide for a little bit, I'm going to be talking to you about wellbeing strategies. But just to start off, I want to talk to you about the fact that a lot of the conversations that I have been having with clients to date and throughout the COVID-19 outbreak have really been focused on managing employees' mental health and wellbeing whilst in lockdown, where employees have either been furloughed or told to sit at home and work from home for the foreseeable future. But now what we're seeing, the lockdown rules start to ease. We're seeing shops and branches are now set to open. People slowly being told to return to the office, which is just another change in what's been a stream of changes for employees and for organisations. So what I wanted to do today is take a slightly different angle with you and talk about the psychological impact of change and how you can build confidence and maintain well-being across your workforce to support them in returning to the office, and how you can stay connected with those who might actually remain at home. So can I have the next slide, please, Kat? Thank you. So what we've seen in response to COVID-19 is what I would basically call rapid organisational change on a global scale. We've all had to adapt to new ways of working with very limited warning and very limited time to prepare or think about how we might go about that, which at times I'm sure has led to feelings of things like frustration or low mood, either within yourself or within your workforce. And so what I wanted to share with you is something that might help to put some of those feelings into context, and that is the Kubler-Ross change curve, which is in front of me now. The change curve is quite well known in the psychological or change management arena. Some of you may have even seen this before. And what it does is basically illustrate some of the possible behaviours and emotions that we and or your employees have likely been experiencing over the last 3 months or so. And as you can see, you can kind of follow on the slide there. So it goes from things like shock and denial to it's only a flu, I now need to buy all of the toilet roll, through to things like frustration and I can't work this way, down to maybe sadness and that feeling of loss of motivation, or maybe that low mood, and then back up into the curve of starting to find a routine and then finally moving through to that acceptance stage and realizing that this is the new normal and perhaps now you're okay with it. And I think one of the challenges that HR and leaders are facing is that to some extent most of us have been able to make our way through this curve or through this change curve and into that area that I was just talking about around the decisiveness and the acceptance stage, where we are really starting to feel comfortable with the new working world. We're starting to feel a bit more productive, but no sooner has that sort of happened and it's been announced lockdown's ending or lockdown's starting to lift and the restrictions are starting to lift, shops and businesses are starting to reopen, and we can start returning people to the office, which throws us all straight back into that state of change. And I think something to recognise here is that not everyone is going to experience change in the same way. So people will go through this change curve at different rates and they'll experience emotions on different ranges. So while some of your employees might be slightly frustrated to begin with, hearing that there's no change coming again, for the most part, they might be excited and enthusiastic to return to the workplace. However, there might be others who are a bit more hesitant or resistant, particularly in that immediate term. And I think that's something that's really being reflected in some of the statistics that we're seeing coming out at the moment. So one example of that is what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the slide, which is some research that was done by PwC, where they went out and they surveyed a whole load of employees around how they felt about returning to the office. And as you can see, 70% of those people that were surveyed indicated that right now there was something that would prevent them from returning to the office or the work site. And if we dig a bit deeper into that, some of the top reasons for not returning were, and not unsurprisingly, fear of getting sick from being back at work, an unwillingness to use public transport, again I think linking into that fear of getting sick, responsibilities as a parent or caregiver, so knowing that the schools still aren't opening and having to take care of children, or having to take care of sick family members. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is how can we build confidence and maintain well-being across our workforce, particularly around that first point where people are going to be feeling really fearful about returning, particularly now that they've had sort of 3 months at home, they've grown accustomed to working from home, or perhaps been furloughed and have been at home now for 3 or so months. Next slide, please, Kat. And so something else that I wanted to introduce you to, that's on the slide at the moment, is the Glyatro or Beckard and Harris's formula to change, which basically aims to provide a simplified way of understanding some of the factors that need to be in place in order to have a better chance of achieving successful change with your employees. Now, the formula basically proposes that organisations should work towards ensuring that the dissatisfaction with how things are now, the vision for the future, the practicality of the first steps that need to be taken in achieving that future state, and the support systems in place for employees all offset or outweigh the feelings of hesitancy in order to help employees prevail in the face of change. So how do we put this into the context when we're thinking about building confidence and maintaining well-being across the workforce? Well, let's start with that dissatisfaction piece. So things that you can do in this area to help include communicating the positives and the advantages of having people slowly return to the office to help increase potential satisfaction with the change. But be conscious that not everyone will be able to, or as we saw on a previous slide, will feel immediately willing to return. So be flexible with your employees. Encourage your managers to talk to their employees about the impending change and get them to listen and really listen to concerns employees may be having around health and well-being. This will really, I guess, provide organisations and provide you with the opportunity to address the concerns in advance, and in turn will increase the satisfaction and the confidence levels within your employees about returning to the workforce. So talking about the vision aspect of this formula, one thing we know from the research carried out throughout COVID-19 is that uncertainty sparks stress and anxiety, and that has been really prevalent in all of the sort of research and media that has come out throughout this. So to help reduce some of that uncertainty and fear, organisations could share a sort of return to the office vision with their employees and come up with a clear strategy to communicate that. It could include things like the steps that are being taken by the business to protect employees' health and safety and well-being upon their return, as well as any new office layout plans that might be in place, particularly when interacting with customers and things like that. So the vision of the new office should be shared in advance so that employees can absorb the changes prior to arriving at the door, and they're not sort of walking into something that's the unknown or they're uncertain about. And I think also communicating that early will provide employees with the opportunity to not only absorb the information, but to make any necessary adjustments in their home life, so things around those caring responsibilities, to really try and, I guess, facilitate their return to the office and alleviate any additional stress that they might have around that. So thinking first steps, the research reiterates that there should be practical and realistic to maintain belief and motivation among their employees. Things that organisations could do in this area include clearly outlining the first steps that are being asked of employees upon returning, and ensuring the steps are readily available for them and really easy to follow. So the steps may include how they should interact with customers, how they can do that safely, employees perhaps starting at different times of the day to manage the numbers in the office, or a part-time return to the office, or perhaps new health and safety protocols and employees will be expected to follow once they're back in, so things like washing hands, using sanitizer products, cleaning desks, etc., etc. I think similarly, companies should really clearly outline the steps that employees will need to take if they actually feel unwell in the office, and make sure that employees have the information that they need in order to confidently manage that situation, because I think that would be a really fear-evoking situation for anybody to be in. Support systems. So since the outbreak of COVID-19, employers have been working to support the health and well-being of their employees. It's been really fantastic to see. It's really put health and well-being on the agenda, and it's really become a priority for most. And so I would encourage organisations from the fact that just because people are starting to return to the office, it doesn't mean that this should become a less important or forgotten topic. I would really encourage organisations to continue to review, to monitor and to promote the support systems that are in place for their employees, and ensure employees know where and how to seek support. So whether that be financial support they're looking for, social support, physical support or psychological support. I think it's important to remember that one of the great things that has come out of COVID-19 and something that employees frequently cite as a real positive is the ability to work from home and the greater flexibility that that's introduced to their working lives. So although people are returning to the office, I think it's important to ensure that that flexibility doesn't just dissipate, and it's important to consider how that can sort of be maintained or worked into sort of the new working world. And we all know that change needs to happen at all levels of the organisation, so giving consideration to how those 4 factors or 4 areas could be applied at the organisational level, manager level and employee level will help support and build that confidence across your employees in the face of what feels like just another change. So next slide. And it's important to not forget about the people who might be left at home. So even though some people will be starting to return to the office, there will be employees who remain at home for various reasons, one of those being employees who are still furloughed. And they may start to feel isolated from colleagues who are returning to the office together. So things that can be done in this space to help alleviate feelings of isolation or disengagement include reminding employees in the office and employees at home to continue to use and post on online resources, such as an internal intranet. Organisations should really ensure that anything that is made available in the office, so say something on a notice board, is also then made available on the intranet or through another medium so that people at home can still access that information. I think, and David talked about this before, but really keeping in contact with employees who remain at home, whether that be through emails or calls, and really encouraging your managers and employees to continue to sort of schedule in those virtual water cooler moments is really important. So really continuing to utilise video conference for meetings, even though some of the employees might be in the office, so that your employees at home aren't excluded from that process. And I think don't underestimate how much sort of work can be achieved through those side of the desk moments, or conversations that you might have with colleagues. So where there might be ad hoc developments or updates or changes, I think managers and I think employers should be conscious and encouraged to share those with employees at home, even if it means just sending a quick email update, just so that people remain on the same page and don't feel that they're being left behind, really. And I think further to that, I think managers and colleagues really should stay in contact with the furloughed employees. And I think David touched on this as well, not just from the perspective of, the scheme and things that might be changing, and from that sort of formal perspective, but also from a social perspective. So ensuring that they remain engaged in the social activities. So arranging a virtual coffee or a quiz night can be a really helpful way to make sure that they're still in contact with their colleagues, and still feel a part of that organisation. And I think just as the last point on there, never underestimate the importance of social interaction, albeit virtually. I think keeping employees connected throughout this, particularly when people start to return to the office and some will be at home, by having things like a weekly virtual lunch or a weekly pub night is a really, really great way to keep people engaged. So thank you. I think that's all from me, and I'll hand back over to Vicky.
Thank you very much. We have had a question from Arctic Travel. They have asked if you have any advice for onboarding new staff whilst you're still in a home working environment.
Yeah, so really good question. And I actually reached out to one of my colleagues this morning who has done a virtual onboarding process just last week. And so I got talking to her about some of the key things or key pieces of advice that she would give other people. And the three things she came up with was make sure that they have the equipment to do the job and that it's actually working. So I think we all understand that having IT issues when you're in the office can be extremely frustrating at the best of times. But at the moment, it can feel even more isolating if you're a new starter and you're coming on board and you can't get your IT and equipment to work. The second thing she said is really invest more time in making those introductions, probably more time than you would normally. So naturally in an office, you can kind of walk around and you can introduce people as you go. That's been made a little bit more difficult in a virtual world. So setting up those meetings for that new starter's first week so that they get to know people and signposting them to things like LinkedIn so that they can start to put, the sort of facial recognition and understanding who's who and showing them that sort of organisational structure. And then I think the third thing she said that's quite important is finding ways to build a sense of, workplace community and culture, even though you're remote. And I think it goes back to that sort of social thing. So really setting up those virtual lunches within the team, setting up those quiz nights so that they get to understand you, the team, and the culture of the team as well.
Yeah, Just one more question, and it was more about using video and, you know, doing a walk round of the office sort of thing before somebody comes back, before everybody comes back into the office. What's your advice on whether that's a good plan?
A video walk around of the office? Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Absolutely. So I think anything you can do to make employees feel more familiar and more comfortable with a new office structure or layout is going to be a real positive, because it allows them to, I guess, digest that information in advance rather than arriving on day one at the door and walking into something that perhaps is unrecognizable to them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Hazel. We'll move on. Thank you very much for your presentation. Our next section is around skills, both in terms of additional skills employees have had to gain as a result of the crisis, and going forward, what gaps may be left for business, especially in the aftermath of furlough and redundancies. I'm going to hand over to Demetrios Bouhalis, who's a professor at Bournemouth University, to tell us more. Demetrios, if you'll switch your camera and your sound on now, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Vicky. I've been following very carefully all the colleagues. I would actually, can I share my screen and play the videos from here? And play the slides from here? It will be easier.
I think probably we're going to have to go with the way we have, with
okay.
apps.
All right. So I think the important thing is that we really need to look into where tourism and travel is going in the longer term, and trying to assess the skills of the new era that is coming as a result of coronavirus. If we can go to the next slide. Rough seas make great captains, and I think a lot of people start realizing that we are actually not going to go back. Let's go to the next slide. We are going to go to a new reality. We are not going to return to the past, but we are going to depart to a new future. Next slide. And the new future is going to be primarily about reignition, starting again the industry, refocus, redesign, and re-engineer. And the reason for that is that the last 6 months have showcased to a lot of people a very different way of working, a very different way of living, and very different way of engaging with a whole range of different players and industries. And I think a lot of people will find that they'll need new skills as they're going forward. The next slide. So I think what in the immediate future we'll need to answer a lot of questions about COVID ready, about smart protocols, process, and will require ecosystems coordination and agility. We'll need to have a lot of information about locations, about space, about how we operate with a lot of processes and business models in order to be able to answer to our guests and to our customers. Next slide. So I think we really need to start looking to what's going to happen with the labor force that is either going to go back to work or it's going to be made redundant and trying to find new opportunities in the near future. Next slide. So I think on the left-hand side, you see the customer concerns, and a lot of the concerns will be about health, safety, security, and we'll need to have an understanding of destinations, facilities, protocols, and emergency procedures to make people trust the system and trust the professionals, so they can have a flexible, trouble-free holiday with cancellations if they need to. And most importantly, that they need to have real-time awareness. And we will need to actually address the take care of me, please, in terms of communications, empathy, sympathy, relationship management, and manage all kind of travel requirements. And that will require skills that has got to deal with specific information about health, safety, security protocols, travel facilitation and management in terms of visas, in terms of which countries are open, and all of those things. And it's the whole range of crisis management and resilience kind of literature and knowledge base. And also there's a lot of skills that they're required about relations and empathy, understanding, being at the position of the customer and to be able to help the customer, and also legal skills because of a lot of legal issues that they're going to emerge. I think the biggest change that has happened in the last few months is the digitization has progressed really, really rapidly. And I think we'll need increasingly real-time management, omni-channel communication. So we will need to communicate wherever our customer is communicating, and 24/7 customer service. What we've seen in the last few months is actually the opposite. What people have done, a lot of travel companies have done, a lot of airlines have done, they've shut down their communications. So if you are trying to go through EasyJet, Ryanair, British Airways, you'll never go through their communication channels. Next slide, please. Digitization transformation is going to be really rapid. And COVID is it brought it already here. For example, in the university, some of my colleagues, they thought they can never teach online. Now, there's no question about whether you can teach online. You just teach online. Next slide, please. So this is coming from banking, but actually it's a very similar kind of skill base that we need. So it's all about communication, it's about digital awareness, it's about agility, it's about operating the digital world, it's about data-driven decision-making and human-centered design. And a lot of those things are going to come into the travel industry. Next slide. I think one of the most important elements where people will need to understand where we are going to be going is real-time co-creation and awareness. The ability to actually operate everything in real time and understand what processes need to be triggered in serving customers in real time. Next slide. And ambient intelligence means that you've got a whole range of different technologies around you in terms of the Internet of Things, the Internet of Everything, 5G, mobile devices, sensors, beacons, and all of this technology and artificial intelligence in order to be able to manage in real time every information that's required towards providing that kind of service. Next slide. I think ultimately, we will need to look into what the next day is going to be requiring in terms of skills and abilities. And I think a lot of people, either in work or those who will be released from work and they'll be looking for future work, will need to develop in order to be able to become much more employable in the marketplace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Demetrios. I was very interested in what you were having to say about your colleagues having to rapidly learn how to do all their teaching online, which we've all had to adapt to this sort of thing. Do you have any advice for our members, many of whom have employees all over the world, as you do students, for how to keep people engaged and how to keep, what's your experience of keeping students engaged?
Well, I think there's so many seminars right now, there's so much educational material that actually has become available. And a lot of us made our educational activities and our educational material freely available to everybody as part of the solidarity that we have in the tourism industry. We really need to help each other to understand and learn from the best practice and engage and develop the skills to actually serve colleagues in the tourism and travel industry, to serve our customers, to serve our suppliers, and make the ecosystem reignite again. I think, I send you, Vicky, my YouTube channel where I've got a lot of material, and actually my YouTube channel has been updated with so much stuff because of conference and events I've organized, and we are freely opening that to everybody to be able to develop their skills, to be able to help each other and to engage in the next day. Because I was hearing the colleagues and David and Hazel about how many people are going to be unemployed and what they're going to have to do to come back into the labor market and what kind of skills they'll need to have in order to operate in the new environment. These things these deals were coming, but actually what has happened in the last few months, they immediately came up to us, and there's not much discussion about it. And I think those digital skills will be absolutely critical in the future.
Thank you very much. Just in the interest of time, I'd like to thank everybody for taking part. As Demetrius said, we will be putting the information that he's given us about his online channels and various information on available. And we've also got, for ABTA partners and members, the ABTA Knowledge Zone, of course, which has a lot of online facilities available there as well. So that's all we have time for today. So thank you all for joining. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Catherine, Rebecca, Anushka, David, Hazel and Demetrius. Please do follow up with the speakers if you have any additional questions. They've provided their contact details on the slides, and the slides will be sent around later this week. We'll also be sending around the recording of the webinar later this week, and it will be available on demand for members and partners via the new Coronavirus Partner Information Hub that we have as well. I also wanted to highlight, for the benefit of ABTA members, that we have our weekly members conference call that takes place weekly on Tuesdays at 11 AM. This call is led by senior members of the ABTA team, and you can submit questions in advance. These issues are picked up by the relevant teams within ABTA. If you'd like an invitation to join the call, please email engagement@abta.co.uk. We'll also be running more of these webinars, so look out for them at abta.com/events. And I hope you've all had a lovely evening, and you all have a lovely evening. Thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.